usually when I meet people who actually label themselves as agnostic, I usually have better conversations with them than the people who are just staunch atheists or whatnot. And I love your approach. So I feel like this will allow us to have a very productive conversation, simply because we're just going to be just discussing these things and whatnot. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. I mean, I don't know philosophy. I've never studied it. I never went to university. I took business and ICT at school and went on to train as a CBT counsellor, which I'm still doing, and training the stock markets. So nothing to do with philosophy or science any which way. But, I'd like to think that I'm reasonably intelligent. I can hold up a decent conversation, which is why I'm interested in this sort of thing. I like watching debates on YouTube. I mean, most of them are just throwing punches at each other, but you get some nuggets of information in there. I'm actually getting a business degree, so and my interest is in philosophy, but like I want to eventually get my PhD in that, but I'm getting a business degree right now, so great.
Completely unrelated.
Perfect time, just when no one's got any money and no one's got any jobs.
It took me a second to get that reference, but yeah.
Well, I guess it'd be cool to start out with, I guess maybe like a
epistemology, maybe. But again, maybe we don't want to bore him with philosophy.
Oh, well, no, you can't bore me. Oh, okay. Trust me.
Well, I feel like on a personal note, kind of, maybe if I can kind of relay kind of my journey up till now, and then so we can kind of get instead of just focusing on the mathematics, we can kind of get a fuller picture of how it's been kind of personally for both of us, I guess you can say. So, I'm gonna be 21 in July, and so I've been ever since I remember. My parents made it a thing to keep me involved in the church, things of that sort. When I was a little kid, I didn't really like going to church because it just was boring. I wanted to go run around, play with friends or whatever, and things. But I remember I was about 5 years old, and I remember, I guess as a little kid, for some reason, for the first time, I remember hearing the gospel for the first time, and in my mind, it made sense. And I remember talking to my father about it, and I did that, classic pray the prayer thing, in the backseat of the car and stuff like that. But ever since that point on, I'd go to church, I'd do youth group, I'd be involved, got baptized, all those different things of that sort. And I remember discovering, so that was kind of my basis. My life was kind of always immersed in the Christian world, pretty much, of that sort. It felt comfortable. That's just all I ever really knew. And then I found out about apologetics around 12, 13, I think. I thought it was really cool, but it was young Earth creationist apologetics I was first introduced to, and that actually ended up playing a detrimental role in how I thought about my faith rather than actually helping it. So I would spend time online and things of that sort, and I came across a channel, I think it was called The Thinking Atheist, and they had a 100-part series refuting creationist arguments or something like that, something crazy like that. And I remember watching them and not really knowing how to respond. And because I thought that my faith was so attached to this one side of Christianity that I was losing it and things of that sort. And what's interesting about that is when I first found that out, literally, this was the day before I was actually going to go to an actual creationist conference. So it was just kind of interesting how that worked out. But so I guess that was the spark that set me to actually, for the first time, really rigorously think intellectually about the faith that I had been so used to holding. Long story short, couldn't defend young Earth creationism anymore, and I actually found out that Christianity is not about that, and I was opened up to this whole new world about what Christianity really is. So fast forward to where I'm at now, with being able, knowing things like hermeneutics, how to interpret scripture properly, how to read the Bible properly, knowing the things about it, New Testament, Old Testament, biblical archaeology, things of that sort, and then getting into natural theology. of those things. I had the backdrop, and the backdrop of my life was Christian, but while keeping that in the back, I was kind of I was intellectually satisfying myself while at the same time having that emotionally be consistent at the same time with that. So where I'm at right now is through those studies and through that journey, I have put my views on the chopping block so much to the point where what I have grown up knowing, I'm still with it. I'm still with it, and I have yet to see anything that to persuade me out of it and things of that sort. So once I started really thinking about it in those terms, it actually really solidified it, not in the terms of confirmation bias way, but wow, I actually didn't even know that I could really go down this far with this particular faith and whatnot. And then, so that's kind of how it's been for me in my journey. And now, I guess with my YouTube channel, Invoking Theism and that sort, if you were to really ask me like, what's the point of my channel? Really, it's just, it's a public expression of my journey in terms of how I'm going to be thinking about the Christian faith and thinking about the world and reality. It's just my public expression of trying to get that out and things I like talking about of that sort. So that kind of characterizes all of that. And the emotional part, you know, as a Christian, you know, I can 100% fully say that I do feel like there is this connection with something called the Holy Spirit, with something called God at the same time. So I do have my interpersonal experience as well. Whether or not, you know, anybody wants to trust that or whatnot, atheists always like to knock it down. But on just that front, when I went through the thinking, it validated also what I felt inside at the same time, but not in terms of confirmation bias, just in terms of it was kind of an uncanny coincidence of how it turned out. So that's kind of where I'm at, and that's how I think about it. And it's just a really cool thing for me to do it this way and talk to other people and hear how they form their worldviews and how they think about reality, and in terms of how I think about reality and things of that sort. So that's kind of where I'm from, and that's how I approach it. And so the philosophy and all that is going to be really, really helpful, because that's what I like to focus on, and how we come to have knowledge, what is knowledge, metaphysics, all those different things, thinking properly, arguments, etc.
It's an interesting way to approach Christianity, with the intellectual mindset with it and the willingness to kind of question the faith. So you started off with young earth creationism, and then began to kind of look at that more intellectually, and came to your own opinion that maybe this aspect of Christianity is not for me, which is to me what, you know, religion is all about, is finding the part of it that applies to you and works for you, and being able to balance religious kind of subjective experience with the more objective analytical part of us is a more complete way of approaching life, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. You know, if you think about it, I have a philosophy of religion book, and it has a section that talks about really, if you think about religion and how it applies to people, you know, we can all disagree with certain aspects, certain religions, how it doesn't match up to what science says or whatnot. But if there's one thing that we can all agree on, the commonality between them is they are each trying to comprehend reality in that own way. You can look at the primitive ones from ancient times, the ones that are still around today. For me, as far as young earth creationism went, it was my faith was so, my own salvation was so tied to this view that this false dichotomy was set up. Either I accept modern science, or I reject Christianity, and I reject Christianity, or I accept Christianity, and I reject modern science. And I came to find out that that is completely not even how it all works. And with finding out that young earth creationism had not only scientific explanatory deficits, but it also had theological in terms of the scriptures themselves, it doesn't work out. So I was able to comfortably ditch that. And once I actually was opened up to this world that most Christians, even throughout centuries and ancient times, actually were not committed to this type of view, and this was not what Christianity was held on. So C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity really, really helps in that sense.
I just finished reading that like
Oh yeah,
days ago.
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a timeless one, but and so really researching that, as you were just mentioning earlier, helped me. I gained more sight, and I was able to see more. So that's how I would characterize that.
So, just for those that aren't maybe aware of the difference between Christianity and Christian apologetics, me being one of them that doesn't understand the difference, what is exactly apologetics as a movement, I suppose?
Do you want me to go, Tim?
Yeah, I was about to pass it to you.
Yeah. So, many will accuse the Bible of, believing that what you know ain't so. That's sort of Mark Twain's definition of faith. But then you have many multiple Bible verses that, like Isaiah 1:18, come down and let us reason, says the Lord. And 1 Peter 3:15 through 16, give a reason for the hope that I have within you for anyone who asks, but do this with gentleness and respect. Right there, Peter, one of the first eyewitnesses of Jesus and his resurrection, is telling you, hey, if someone has sincere questions, give them answers, if they're sincere, of course. And of course, the passage is in context of persecution, but when an atheist attacks my beliefs, that is a form of persecution. Obviously, it's not extreme persecution whatsoever, but they're basically calling my beliefs fallacious. If I have good reasons for my beliefs, apologetics is giving those reasons. And it's almost a way of evangelism, because when one is asking these questions, you open up the conversation for, what Christianity is about. Obviously, you don't immediately get the cross and the whole gospel message because they have barriers that are blocking from them. And apologetics is basically helping removing those barriers and seeing the more intellectual side of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
brilliant. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I have an article, 5 Reasons for Apologetics in a Christian context, and I haven't found too many Christians who would disagree with my reasons.
So that makes sense. So effectively, apologetics is giving the reasons for your beliefs to those that maybe don't see in the same way. I mean, for me, the Bible, I've never read it. I don't know how you manage to remember all the passages by number and by content, because that's very impressive to me. I struggle to remember how to solve a Rubik's Cube, But the Bible was always an interesting thing for me as a source of evidence, because to me it doesn't quite work for the way that I see evidence, because we know that it was written by men, which was apparently originally the word of God interpreted by men and written by men, and then it was given multiple different iterations and different changes over the many years of its creation to the version that we have now, which is not in the original language and the original context that it was originally written in, with things added, things taken off. So I can't see it as a reliable source of information, but that's just the way I see
what
it.
I think you're proposing there would attack like an extreme form of inerrancy in which every little detail is dictated by God and there's no aspect of human writing in it. I think classical or scholarly approach to inerrancy is in the message of the gospel and truths God wanted to reveal to those people. As John, what's John Walton's saying, Tim? The Bible was not written to us before us.
Yes, yeah.
So there are certain messages that are meant for the people it's written to, the human aspect. But then there are hidden messages, and not hidden, pretty clear, obvious, timeless messages that are meant for all peoples in all times. I'll just say stuff like Jesus' resurrection, the doctrine of God's triune nature, the power of the Holy Spirit. Stuff like this is very clear in the text. And then you have, historical details that most of the time when people claim they are wrong, archaeology and history from my studies show them to be correct, and that gives me more reliability for the Bible. But what you propose there, if the manuscript evidence for the New Testament documents and even Old Testament is very well recorded compared to documents that record Alexander the Great's history. Like, we don't get any of his writings until, 400, 500 years afterwards by a dude named, starts with an A name. I'm horrible with ancient Greek names and ancient names in general. But, like, if we want to stay consistent, then I would doubt Alexander the Great's existence. I'm not saying you were doubting Jesus' existence or whatnot. It's just an example of what I was hearing there.
Well, I couldn't have an opinion really on whether Jesus existed or not. I've never looked at it.
No,
I don't see.
Yeah,
I see
same.
no reason to doubt that Jesus was an individual. I'd think if someone was to ask me who I thought Jesus was, I'd say, well, I mean, I couldn't say he was. I'd say if he existed, he would have been a spiritual teacher, similar to Gautama the Buddha and other figures who were teaching. I mean, the religions seem at the very core the same. It's just that the way that the teachings have been interpreted give rise, it seems, to the different religions. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but that's the way I see it.
Well, to count, this isn't so much an apologetical response. This is more of a theological response. I think the biggest difference between Jesus and other figures, first of all, I think the historical documents are much better recorded when you look at examples like Buddha and Muhammad and so on. But Jesus claimed to be God, or at least had a signature of divineness. And just one clear example I always go to, when doubting Thomas sees Jesus and he puts his holes in the finger of the spear wound, he says, "My Lord and my Theos," which in the Greek is God. And in the context, it only makes sense as God. And if Jesus didn't think himself as God, then he would have said, "No, do not call me God. That would be blasphemy." And there are many other passages in which the Jews accused him of blasphemy, which in their law, if you claim to be God, you can be stoned. And they did try and stone him in John 10, I think. And John 1 gives clear passages as well. Even Mark, people argue that, well, Mark didn't have any real divine aspect to Jesus, but the walking on water passage, I think there's a few times he says, "You have heard it said, but I tell you." If Jesus doesn't have a divine aspect, or at least isn't on a divine mission, he can't really change the scriptures yet. While other religions, yes, they have good teachings. I would say that Christianity doesn't claim that you can't be moral or no morality without the Bible. I think because Paul makes clear that all the Gentiles have the moral law written upon their heart, in which C.S. Lewis in Abolition of Man talks about the Tao, which is just summarizes all of the basic goods and values every culture besides his time, up to his time, held. There's a common thread, like the Golden Rule is just a common example. Even Confucius, before Jesus, held to the Golden Rule. And all the religions hold to some form of that. And then and most cultures, honor is held high as a high standard. There's just a common thread. Abolition is a good book. Abolition of Man is like 100 pages, pretty short, that goes into this. But and one more aspect I would make a clear distinction is, it's always man trying to reach God. While in the Christian version of the gospel, man has fallen and have tried to, but have failed. And God is so gracious and loving, he takes human form. Whether you want to question that's logically possible, I would argue that it is. It's very hard to conceive a God taking human form, but that's not the point. God takes human form to be with us and to focus on our problems now, not even so much into the long distance afterlife as you like to study, but God himself focused on the hungry, the poor, the sick, the needy. And I think a lot of the Christians miss that aspect of the gospel, that they make it all about fire insurance and the afterlife. It's just like, no, Jesus was concerned with that and how you lived your life and your salvation, but he was also really concerned about those who needed his help and who were sick and poor and so on.
That's one thing that confuses, well, not confuses me, but interests me about the faith, is that obviously you have the belief in heaven and hell, the opposite place where you go depending on whether you have faith in Jesus Christ or not. And what concerns me is, to me, it seems unusual that your passage into heaven would rely on whether you believe in a certain thing or not, as opposed to the actions that you take.
Well, can I discuss? There's two aspects of faith, and C.S. Lewis talks about this in Mere Christianity. Well, I knew about this before I finished Mere Christianity. So one would be yes, you believe that, God exists. Obviously, he's a triune nature. Jesus was the Son of God, but that doesn't mean that you're a Christian. James says in James 2:9, I think, even the demons know and shudder, but yet do not believe. And the second part of faith is action, in which you trust God, you pick up your cross and follow him once you have that knowledge. And I would say, oh, did we lose? Is this still recording? Because I just got a message saying.
Yeah, I got it as well. It's still going. It said
okay.
It said you've run out of time, or you're close to running out of time, but we've given you extra, but some promotional nonsense.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, thanks Zoom for the extra time.
Yeah, what was I talking about now?
Good question. We were talking about there was you can believe in God, but not necessarily
yeah. And the second aspect, action. God ultimately judges you on that action and what you take, what you take from that. So I would say God judges us on the knowledge we have and the action we take with that knowledge. So it's not just, believe the error and raw of silliness of the gospel in which you believe things in spite of evidence and then you're somehow saved because of that. No, it requires action in your life to submit yourself to Christ, which is ultimately loyalty, as Pistis is described by Inspiring Philosophy in his one video response to error and wrong.
And before I saw that video, I was thinking that I was listening to these people talking about faith being, as Aaron Ross, or Aaron Ra, I always say Aaron, as he describes it, being belief without evidence. I'm thinking, but that's not how I would see it. If I have faith in a friend to do something, I'd have faith only if I know that they have the capability and I've got good reason to believe that they would do it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have faith. I'd say, no, I'll ask Bob instead. So, to me, faith can be belief without evidence. That's one definition. But I'd also, the way I'd use faith is in, I have faith that he will do this because I've got good reason to believe that he would. Otherwise, I wouldn't have faith in it. Maybe I've missed the mark, but that's kind of how I'd see it.
I would say some Christians, yes, have the belief in spite of evidence, whether they consider their own personal experiences as self-justifying evidence. I would say they can be justified in their belief, but obviously that won't work for someone like you or even me as a Christian. But I think when we look at Hebrews 11, which is the hall of faith described, everyone had miracles given to them, and they had their faith, which was action ultimately and commitment to God. And it's not like they're believing in spite of evidence or in absence of evidence. And God judges the Israelites sometimes in the Old Testament harshly because he delivered them out of Israel and split the Red Sea. I almost said split the moon in half. No, split the Red Sea. And to me, if you have that knowledge of God and yet you turn your back on him, you're probably going to get some judgment towards you at that point. Because
at that point, you're just denying reality at that point.
Yeah, an atheist would attack God in the Old Testament, but it's just like you need to understand the context in which the Jews were living.
I mean, yeah, if I was to walk out the house and suddenly I'd see, what's a good example of a miracle? I don't know, but a miracle that was not in the realms of what should be possible if materialism and other general sciences are correct. If I was to see that, I don't know how you could get away with not thinking that there's some kind of higher power that's causing that. If all other definitions and explanations fail, the only thing you can really turn to is I must have hallucinated or I must have believed something that. But at that point,
that shows me you're a lot more open than online atheists. Because
I don't see how could you not see that.
Well, they would just be like, well, it's just some unknown natural thing because the supernatural, I don't like that distinction, but the supernatural hasn't been demonstrated, therefore it can't be a miracle. It's like, well, if that is the demonstration, you're not open to it. So
isn't it the same thing though, supernatural and unknown natural? If we see it and it's not in the current realms of what we know is nature, it's supernature because we don't know it. But
that's actually a good point, and that's probably why I don't like that distinction, because basically anything that would violate, if that's even the right word, because violating would presuppose that the laws of physics have sort of an ontological essence, which is just being or substance, and not just descriptions of what we observe of current three-dimensional science that we're living in right now. But if something violates those, then yeah, I think that would be something beyond our current understanding and is something supernatural in that sense.
Yeah, but that wouldn't essentially mean it's supernatural. It's natural. It's just a form of natural that we haven't seen yet. I mean, God, as you know, the Christian God or general theistic God, would, in my opinion, be nature, but just a different form of nature or a different being in nature.
Mm-hmm.
That falls outside of
I think it's really helpful.
Nature would just be like ontological existence itself, and you could have higher forms of that other than our own.
The way I characterize it is I refer to the this physical reality as I usually say it's this part of reality. That's how I look at it. So there's the reality of God, there's reality that we live in, and I don't separate the two as distinct. I just say that we live in this part of reality. So that's because I also too as well think that the supernatural natural distinction can sometimes be unproductive in conversations by simply just kind of breaking down those labels and just putting it as, well, what is reality, what comprises it.
It's a case of definitions, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
What we mean. Generally, people mean the same thing, they're just labeling it differently and getting into ruckuses for no reason. At least that's what I've seen.
When the atheist says unknown natural law, I think they mean something of our current understanding that we yet don't understand how to explain this thing that doesn't work by our current understanding, and some form of our current understanding that we don't have. And to me, it's almost a logically impossible thing when you're going to explain something in the terms that we yet don't understand, but yet you're assuming that it's in a way that we will understand in the context of our current physics. And
but
to me, that's just a contradictory epistemology.
At that point, that's not science, is it? That's
conclusions and knowledge itself is philosophy. I wouldn't claim that would be science. I would say doing the tests, the observations, is science. And then when you get into philosophy of science and when you draw worldview conclusions, I would say you're getting into philosophy at that point. But when you're doing science, you're assuming your metaphysics, which is just your principles in which how reality operates. So if you're a materialist, everything just works in. And a lot of Christians assume materialism in some fashion is true just in the context of the observation. But if your worldview is completely materialistic, obviously there's no openness to supernatural, no matter what event it is.
I mean, there's no doubt at all from anybody that materialism has... there are very materialistic aspects to life. We know that because otherwise we wouldn't exist. But as you say, the problem comes where we're so linked with that materialism that anything that posits hypotheses beyond that framework is straight away must be explained either now or later by materialism and aspects of materialism that maybe we haven't found yet, as opposed to, well, maybe this is something of the universe of reality that exists beyond a materialistic framework. A lot of my research has been on the near-death experience, veridical perception in out-of-body experiences, psi phenomena, which I haven't really got into much, but I plan to. And I've spoken with researchers, highly respected researchers in the fields, who come to the same conclusion, that it suggests that perhaps consciousness can exist without the brain, or at least separate from the brain. It's not created by it. And I think the evidence is reasonably strong to suggest that, especially when you take into account the near-death experiences that have veridical perception away from the physical body, in different rooms, in different places, in different countries sometimes, that are confirmed as correct by multiple witnesses. And you listen to the explanations and you think, well, that works, but that doesn't explain this major aspect of it, which again has been confirmed by third parties. So either we say they're lying, they're selling something, they're deluded, or perhaps we don't know as much as we think we do about the universe, and there's more that we don't know in different forms other than materialism.
Well, if these are souls, that may not be the best word, but people relate to it and understand this immaterial aspect of us. If there are these agents in which your body is dead and you're disembodied, and you're having these conscious experiences and having memory and so on, I don't see how you can explain that on any form of materialism, and I think God would be the best explanation as an immaterial agent himself, and could make other beings like himself, limited beings, obviously not gods themselves, but human beings made in the image of God. I would be more inclined to use not near death, out of body experiences as evidence for God or some form of that.
Yeah. See, I wouldn't quite go that far and claim that this is evidence of a God. I'd just say that this is evidence that there's more than we currently understand beyond physicalism. What that is, we don't know. A good example is, I can't remember who it was, but I was watching, I think it was on Skeptico, on the Skeptico podcast, and it was a guy, well-known skeptic, I can't remember who it was, but was saying, well, okay, so you're saying that consciousness lifts off the brain and can see without eyes, hear without ears, smell without a nose, whatever. So explain to me, how can this happen? And I was listening to it and I was thinking, it's not the point to explain. We don't have a clue how it happens, but the fact is, here's the data, it does happen, and it shouldn't. There's no point, we can't explain it. That's like, trying to explain what 10th dimensional reality is like. We can't conceive of that, we're stuck in the third.
Well, I always use the moon landing. We don't know how the moon landing happened, but yet it did, and you could almost argue from a skeptical standpoint, well, we haven't seen moon landings happen before, you haven't demonstrated them, so it's more likely that was faked, since the arms race.
Yeah, but the Earth's flat anyway, that doesn't matter.
Well, yeah, true.
There's a dome, you just hit the dome.
Yeah, that's right. That's a funny argument to get into, that is. That's one I'm not touching. Again,
Yeah, right.
no point. You're flogging a dead horse.
Yeah, on that, I remember one time I sent out a tweet that I myself didn't think was controversial, but it ended up being controversial. I got a lot of responses, and I said that, if we're looking at our worldviews, and I like the way Dr. Josh Rasmussen puts it. He says that our worldviews are like maps, and that sometimes, if we're trying to get to a certain destination, and we're using the wrong map, we're gonna get lost. We're not gonna be in the right place. So we need to have the right map, the right worldview map. And so I was kind of going off of that idea. I was saying, if the current worldview you hold simply cannot account for something fundamental about reality, but let's say another one can, in a concise, cogent way. I said, if we're going to say that we are people who want to follow reason, want to follow science and things of that sort, I say that then you should be comfortable opting in for that particular explanation of what that worldview offers, not say to jump over to that worldview, but maybe there's something that you need to update yours about. And I said, you should be comfortable doing that. Because we know that if we look at science is tentative, it's contingent upon future data, and we update our models accordingly. And I was thinking, and I was going along the same lines, we should update our worldviews accordingly. And I said, if you refuse to do that, then I'm thinking that there's some underlying kind of motivation for not doing so. But I'm saying you're not being true to reason and to the science we say that we want to respect and follow. And a lot of people did not like that. But I was coming at it not even from a theistic point of view. I was just coming at it from a person who wants to see reason as a way to see into the world.
It's unfortunate that people are very quick to condescend.
Well, that shows you they have a problem with their worldview at that point.
It shows that they have insecurities, because you're threatening something that they hold that close that they feel they need to defend it. It's it's a fight or flight thing. I mean,
it's almost like a mental crutch of some sort.
It is. I mean, I'm a training CBT therapist, and I've had anxiety for years, and you can see it's the same kind of thing that anxiety is. Something's being threatened, so you respond to it. And in terms of anxiety, your body responds and you feel like crap. But when a worldview gets challenged, it seems the only way to approach that is to be nasty, unnecessarily so.
Yeah.
It's the same from both sides, theistic, atheistic. It's the same both ways.
Yeah. I would say the Christians who act out of accordance, since they have a moral guidework and actual worldview and religion and defend claims, and so they act not in accordance with that whenever they're nasty to people who challenge their beliefs. But atheists, whenever they do it, they obviously don't have any sort of worldview telling them not to, unless they try and develop some form of moral realism, which I don't think will work under their worldview.
The whole moral argument, that seems to be a big one, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, that's a timeless. That will never go away.
No. I mean, I don't take morals from any religion. I take morals based on my experiences, what I'd like to happen to me, what I'd like to happen to, what I'd like to happen to me is what I try to do to other people. Of course, being human, you forget that when someone annoys you.
Well, would you say that there are just moral truths that are just common sense, and when people attack them, they're denying common sense? It seems like not to murder people is a good example.
Well, when it comes to murder, I mean, in the end of the day, all these morals are ideas that humanity have created. The universe couldn't care less if you go out and kill someone or not. The difference between you doing that is what your opinion of it is. Where you get that opinion from, whether it's religion or your own morality or what someone told you, what your parents taught you. At the end of the day, all morals seem to me subjective. It's just the source where they come from is a bit different.
Well, I like how C.S. Lewis would respond to that claim in Christianity. The multiplication table is taught to us as kids, but clearly it's describing something true about reality. And I think everyone, and in Abolition of Man, which may be a good book because you don't have to go into in-depth philosophy and moral realism, I think Abolition of Man just makes the point well that all cultures have held these intuitive, non-scientifically verified truths of morality, that you ought not do this or that. And as I talked about before, a gold rule would be common to that. And it's just common sense, and it's just true because of that. And to doubt that would almost be a category error when we're investigating morality itself. So I don't think, obviously, when it comes to the theological virtues, as C.S. Lewis talks about, hope, charity, and love in the Christian context, obviously you get that from Christianity. And so I'm not saying people can't hold those as virtues, but when it comes to the justification, I would say it's more grounded in Christianity. But when it comes to like prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice, or just virtue in general, people can be virtuous in spite of any religion or God belief. But how they would justify that if they want to make it as an objective claim of reality, I think you have to start going into the realms and investigating religion at that point. Well, I think these are just truths that we take as real and true just because we can't operate outside of that. We are moral agents. That's just how we are, as natural theology would say. And I think when people start attacking it and calling it subjective, I'm not saying you are, but generally when I have these conversations, there's underlying reasons why they do this, and it's just assertions that it's just culture made. And I would just argue, well, if that's the case, then let's start talking about math and logic, or those just cultural and semantics at that point. But I'm not accusing you of that just when skeptics do that in general. I think there's more reasons for why they're calling it subjective. So.
That's exactly why I don't touch this kind of stuff, because it's too complicated for me. I'm interested in what happens after death. All this other moral stuff, I'll leave that for the philosophers because it's controversial and everybody's going to have a different opinion forever. You're never going to get to one.
It seems like to me then that you would take more of instead of an epistemological standpoint of how we know morality, you would want to look at the metaphysics and see how reality is, and then see if there are moral facts from that. So you would almost be like Aristotle in the sense that you look at the particulars of things and see if there's really a moral essence in reality, instead of saying, well, we have these moral claims that are justified in our epistemology, but we don't necessarily have to justify them in ontology. So what would you say then that if Christianity is true, for example, then objectively speaking, the Christian virtues would be objectively true about reality, and that one ought to do those?
If Christianity is 100% true?
Not 100%, most likely. I don't think we can prove Christianity to be 100% true. There are some methods of apologetics like presuppositionalism that almost tries to do that, but I think it fails because clearly it relies on inductive human interpretation that is probabilistic in nature, not like, each interpretation is equally valid. There's obviously some interpretations of certain passages that are better than others. But I won't use the word prove, but I would say if one has rational warrant that Christianity is, like, let's say 85% true, then the morality that it claims to be objective would be objective from those claims. Would you agree with that statement then?
It makes sense to me. I mean, if it's true beyond reasonable doubt, then why wouldn't that be true?
Cool. I think you're much more open than most skeptics.
Well, I mean, this just makes logical sense, doesn't it? If something's true, you've got more reason to believe that most of its tenets are true than not.
Yeah.
I mean, whether I believe that or not, I don't know. But
so, let me ask you this question. I think there is historical evidence for the Exodus and so on. It's also not strong for the resurrection or the New Testament. But if Jesus was God and did rise from the dead, and that would be a proof of his God, of his divine attributes, or a probabilistic case. Would you say, since he said the Exodus happened and the Old Testament laws were given by God, would you probably accept those as given by God?
You'd have to tell me what the Exodus is. I've got no idea.
Oh, okay. So basically, when God rescues the Jews through Moses out of Egypt and then delivers them through the parting of the Red Sea and so on, and gives them the commandments and the new law, the Mosaic covenant.
Mm-hmm.
But,
so what was your question again? So if
there's not as there, I would say there is historical evidence where it's not as strong as other claims in the New Testament, just because you're dealing with two different time periods and your expectation should be lowered, but your standard of evidence should. And there is a distinction there I always make. But a lot of skeptics will just say there's no evidence for the Exodus whatsoever. So I'll ask the question: okay, if Christ did rise from the dead, and most likely that would guarantee his claims about himself are true, liar, Lord, lunatic, the famous trilemma. He's neither Lord nor lunatic. He's obviously Lord at that point. And if he claimed that the Exodus happened, historically speaking, would you accept that as true, just on the merit of what he claimed there?
So if Jesus rose from the dead, and that can be proven beyond reasonable doubt, then that to me would show that, something's behind that, and clearly this historical evidence has given that accurately. So if the same source is also given evidence for the Exodus, I'd say you're perfectly justified in believing that. I don't see anything wrong with that. It depends, of course, on the quality of the evidence, and each person will interpret the evidence differently. But I'd say, it got perfect justification for believing that to be true. Why not?
Cool. You're a much better person to have these conversations with.
No, this is very pleasant. This is
as I say, I'm not trained in philosophy or logic, but I just use what I know to say what I think. That's just my opinion, though.
The atheists who claim to be the champions of reason and logic. That's why I literally named my one fake podcast "Atheism Through Logic and Reason," because they always claim to be the champions. They claim to study this stuff, and you understand it better than them, and you haven't studied it yourself, apparently.
But I mean, if you're going to claim to be very logical and very reasonable, then you also have to be open-minded to the fact that you might be wrong. And chances are, the size and complexity of the universe and reality, we're wrong about a lot of things, or at least very incomplete. So to be able to claim that something is definitely correct or definitely wrong isn't logical, surely. In hypothetical situations like you give there seem perfectly reasonable. That's not, it's obviously not the case that there's a definite, beyond reasonable doubt proof that Jesus was to be resurrected or was resurrected. But if there was, and the accounts in the Bible give you that, then I don't see why.
I find it interesting. It's funny because you look at these out-of-body experiences, and obviously that's something. Would you claim that is something supernatural and not described by what we know now? I think you claimed that earlier, because when dude asked you how does that work, it's almost a category error. I don't know how it works, but it just does. Yeah,
certainly. The out-body experience, if it is true that the spirit or the soul or the consciousness can leave the physical body and see things in the physical world, then that's beyond what we can currently naturally understand.
So wouldn't you say then that resurrections are more plausible at that point, since people were having these post-death experiences?
I wouldn't say it is more plausible. I'd say it's just as plausible, because it's if we can see these things in out-of-body experiences that are taking place, there's no reason to deny something else supernatural or whatever happened. It's just whether there's strong enough evidence to support that or not. You don't dismiss it outright. That'd be stupid.
Yeah, and I think the biggest mistake is that atheists will approach the minimal facts case, even though there's maximal facts for the reliability of the resurrection and so on. But their approach has been with facts case that most apologists will give. Actual historians, not just Christian apologists, who will give. And their naturalism, no matter what, you can refute the empty tomb, the wrong tomb theory, the conspiracy theory, all these other natural explanations. You can refute those, and they agree. Yeah, it doesn't really count for the evidence, but it's still something unknown and natural. You can't invoke something miraculous. And Gary Habermas always uses these out-of-body death experiences as a counterexample in which, you should be more open to the supernatural at this point, because these are well medically documented events. Obviously, there's a few common themes in these medical journals of people apparently seeing the death angel or whatnot. This was just from one lecture I watched from Dr. Gary Habermas. You may know more about that, but it's just to make a point that clearly, if these happen, then God could probably raise Jesus from the dead, or Jesus could probably raise from the dead in a supernatural way, perhaps just not a natural way. Or,
I mean, the thing
if you
is,
get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, with God, as he's allegedly able to do pretty much anything beyond the realms of natural, there's no way you could ever, you couldn't ever prove that something happened, because the only means we have to prove things is through material observation, empirical data. And by definition, if God can do something that doesn't fall within that, you're never going to be able to prove that.
Well, I would say that in science you can't prove things. You just give higher, beyond a reasonable doubt.
To the most reasonable explanation, yeah.
But I would say there are things we know with absolute certainty, just from my philosophy perspective. Like, I know that I'm experiencing something right now. I know that consciousness is real. Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And this call, I know I'm having this call. The details I'm not 100% certain of, but I know I'm having this call, and I'm experiencing something I call invoking theism, or seeking I. And I also know there's such thing as a capital T, because as St. Anselm point out, it would be true that nothing existed before anything existed, so truth would have to exist, since it's just a description of things ultimately, and even nothing would be a thing, in which that's why the idea of there being nothing is logically incoherent. And I know that the laws of logic are true, that something cannot be true and false in the same place at the same time. And I also know that there's a true dichotomy. It's one or the other, it can't be both. I would also claim to know, I did this on my Discord server the other night. There's one more claim. I can't remember. I'm also absolutely certain that I can't be absolutely certain of science itself, of things made in science. There's a few things I would claim to have, Cartesian certainty of, but I don't remember them at the moment. So I don't have Cartesian certainty at the moment of the things I know I have Cartesian certainty of.
That seems to be something that people miss, is that science is not 100% a reliable method as it currently is, because,
well, as Tim said, models are changing, and if you have this idea that our current models are infallible, and let's say we both hold to the theory of biological evolution, but we don't accept the worldview conclusions made by materialists.
I think at this point, to deny evolution takes place is on par to believing that the Earth is, or denying that the Earth is round, because there's just enough. There's a lot of evidence to support it.
I had this discussion last night. I'm more certain that Jesus existed than of the claims made from a few bones and fossil records of our human origins. I'm honestly more. I think we're more justified in believing in historical documented events by human observation and testimony than a few scientific conclusions. Now, obviously, when it comes to genetics, that's just stuff we're studying now. So obviously, we're going to be certain of chromosome 23. But our inductive conclusion of that, based on previous fossils and so on, and a few bones that we dig up in the ground, I'm not saying that's not good evidence for evolution. I'm just saying it's less evidence than, let's say, we have for the existence of Jesus through archaeology and documents of ancient history and so on. So I'm more certain of that than going back. But to be fair, we should expect less archaeological evidence for the fossil record, because fossils decay, bones decay much rapidly, and fossils, from my understanding, are things preserved, and you have less of those preservations. And if you have higher populations, then you would expect a certain amount of fossilization and fossils to be found. So I'm not lowering my standard. No, I'm not lowering my standard, but I'll lower my expectations, and I would still have a more certainty of historical events, but at the same time, that I'm not going to use the evidence we would expect for 2,000 years ago and lower the standard of evidence we should have for 500,000 years ago, or a million years ago, whenever humans branched off with apes, or however they work out the details. I don't know all the details. I'm not a biologist. I just accept the consensus at that point, because first of all, it's easily compatible with Genesis 1 through 3, and there's so much work. Literally, young Earth creationists, I think, dedicate all their time looking into the biology instead of the actual ancient texts themselves. And that to me is literally taking man's word over God's word. That popular meme that G-Man made up, but I popularized through my channel.
I mean, I can't really comment on the evidence for the historical.
Jesus,
I've never looked at it.
I'm just saying.
Word on that.
And I'll just claim. I'll be fair. I'll just claim history in general. I'm more certain of than our inductive claims from. Obviously, there's a lot more in science. Sorry, but obviously there's more stuff in how they work out genetics, and I would say that the conclusion that we have ancestry is not proven, but shown through genetics and not necessarily through past induction, but the specifics of our ancestry, I think I would be less certain of than historical events, if you get that distinction. Because the genetics, how we do our test for genetics, when they get to spit or whatever in the bag and then do that induction, they basically do that with all human species. So that I would be more certain of, perhaps, than historical evidence, since that's just observation itself. It tells us that we would have to have ancestry and able to do that in the first place. But when you tell me who my ancestors are, you're going to have to start looking into history itself and archaeology and inductive reasoning at that point. And farther back we go, I'll say we would be less certain, but at the same time, we should lower our standards of evidence and expect the same amount of evidence for something 2,000 years ago versus a million years ago.
Absolutely. But coming back to, science, it seems to be misunderstood that science is kind of a set methodology, that methodology is correct. First thing is, we're assuming that methodology is correct. We can see that it's worked in the past, but we can't say whether it works for the entirety of reality.
In the future, that's just a basic problem of induction itself.
Yeah.
Well, I think a helpful thing to point out too is that the scientific process is actually differs among which field that you're studying. So the same process you'd use in the same process you'd use in chemistry will not be the same process you use in geology or biology. And what's really interesting about this is I'm taking an astronomy class currently, and our first assignments were actually on understanding the philosophy of science and scientific methodology. And I asked my professor if she disagrees with scientific process, and she pointed out something really interesting to me, that there is really no set, this is it. This is the scientific method, this is the scientific process, and this is what everybody has to follow. There's disagreements among people and among philosophers of science of how exactly it works and things of that sort.
Well, a good example that T-Jump really focuses on is predictions. Like, he holds that as almost as deductive reasoning. It almost seems like, well, falsifiability is Karl Popper, but people argue in philosophy of science of the details of predictability, and even that is debated, and I think it's unreasonable for him to hold that if a certain model, that, let's say, idealism, that he kept accusing of Kyle of not having good predictions, and therefore we shouldn't accept it whatsoever, or even assign probability to it, I think, then I think that's just an unreasonable view of science itself.
Well, I mean, future testable predictions works very well for what we
I'm just
understand.
saying the details of that are debated in some philosophy.
Yeah.
Or maybe falsifiability I may be thinking of, but even predictions themselves, we should at least admit that predictions of the future could possibly be wrong, since that's the basic problem of induction. How do you know that tomorrow's going to be the same as well? You just have to assume it's going to be, but something could easily happen that our current predictions for certain models could easily change based off of the laws of physics changing themselves. But I always go to quantum mechanics because we don't have to get into that. But,
He's like quantum mechanics.
That's a big one. That I've dabbled in that a little bit, but my God.
Yeah, I just use that as an example of we clearly do not understand anything, and science can easily change and isn't objective in the sense of certainty. But possibly justify true belief, sure, but that can easily change. Well, I would say things like logic. I'll always be certain of. I don't think there can be an argument made against the law of non-contradiction, because you're always presupposing truth values, and those presuppose logic itself. And I think it just becomes a vicious circle and infinite regress at that point, and you never have an explanation for anything, and therefore can't do science or induction or abduction or any other epistemological methodology. That's why I think nominalism, which does say that mathematics and logic is ultimately just human construction, I think you might as well just be an epistemological nihilist at that point.
Yeah, I think that's something that that we all can have an agreement on about how that works, and science, the reason why we're able to kind of distinguish between what is, and Karl Popper again labeled as pseudoscience versus actual science, is science does not only seek to confirm, but science is it seeks to good theories and good models can have the potential to be falsified or eliminated. And that is one of the hallmarks of science, as well as the uniformity assumption or presupposition that
Hume's assumption of the uniformity of nature. Hume's assumption of the uniformity of nature in his argument against miracles.
Right. Well, yeah. We have never been to we've never been 1,000 light years away, but we assume that gravity and space-time curvature will be acted the same way. And so these hallmarks of science are important and need to be taken into account with doing that. And it's interesting because I like to use some of the hallmarks of science when I'm dealing with worldviews. Now, dealing with worldviews and science are very different, because thinking about a worldview won't give you a laptop, but the scientific process can. But I like to be consistent and apply the same. There's something in science that we value that allows us to come to truth, and applying that to our own worldviews and how we think should also be valued.
Mm-hmm. I mean, science can give you progression in technology and human function, but it can't give you meaning or understanding really of yourself and what it means to be alive. The big questions, the only ones that really matter.
Yeah, science flies you to the moons. Religion flies planes into buildings. So
that's right.
Project all religions. So.
Well, what's really good. What's good about that is I remember philosopher J.P. Moreland, and he said that he was a scientist before he became a philosopher. And he remember having a conversation with somebody saying, why the heck did you do that? Why did you go from a scientist to a philosopher? And he said, there are certain things in philosophy that science will never ever be able to touch. Like, for example, science will never be able to convince me that my view on torturing babies for fun is immoral. He said there's nothing about science that 1,000 years from now science will be able to confirm that is not moral. And
all it just describes is the process of what the baby would go through and stuff, but like any prescription about reality itself that says don't do that is a form of a priori reasoning, basically not scientific reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me science can describe the world and the universe, but it can't explain why it's there.
It's not
and what it means to be there.
And that's why I think a lot of atheists adopt scientism, which is everything has to be scientifically verified or empirically proven, or even you can include an induction in there. That's why they think these why questions and should questions, odd questions about morality are just useless. And I think when you have to do that with your worldview, and reject what society and cultures have held.
Yeah. But as soon as you think it's pointless, then you're immediately assuming that there is no basis for that. No, there is no basis for morality, and that's an assumption.
Yeah.
And that's not something that can be scientifically verified.
Yeah, and then they're attacked the Bible and religions, and we're going to release you from the shackles of religion, as Tim and I always say.
Yeah.
But
I mean, if it works, religion and being religious and not being religious will work for different people depending on their background, their culture.
Sure, that's why I think Christianity stands apart, because like there is such a thing as Christian apologetics. Now you have Mormon, Islamic apologetics, which is fine, but Eastern religions aren't really focused on logic and stuff. They're more focused on the subjective experience, and some philosophy, but they're not really focused on any scientific or logical aspects of religion as you described there. It's more of the experience itself. And I think Buddhists, I think their epistemological system would be experientialism, where their knowledge is based on experience almost alone. And that's why I would have problems with Eastern religions like that. I think they affirm truths that are, ideas of the supernatural, which is a common thread in all religions, and why the atheist says, I reject all of them, therefore I have a less burden of proof. No, you have to refute almost every aspect or show that the supernatural is not possible whatsoever in order to even hold the lack of belief position. They call it the null hypothesis, which is I don't have to believe anything until you prove it to me, which is just like, okay, the flat earther can say the same thing to you and then be unconvinced by your evidence, but you can't really contribute much to the conversation. So Tim described his testimony. I didn't really give mine. I'll make it short. Basically, I grew up, my father was, Christian, but like he didn't practice it as much. My mother was extremely religious in the dogmatic sense, which drove me away, because I would start asking questions about young earth creationism, which is something I taught as doctrine. It's up there as well. I wasn't even taught basic understanding of the Trinity, but yet I was taught a basic understanding of young earth creationism, which I think is the most dangerous, and why there's many people leaving, because they don't even understand the basic aspects of God and who Jesus is, the incarnation, the Trinity, and the resurrection itself, but yet they understand young earth creationism to be Christianity itself. And I had that understanding, and that drove me away to a position like you. I was sort of a closeted agnostic, and my freshman year, middle school, freshman year of high school, I had these doubts of Genesis 1. I'd be like, well, how could Adam and Eve, why at one point would incest be all right for Adam and Eve to populate the earth, but then when these New Testament, the New Covenant laws, incest is wrong? Isn't that a contradiction in moral terms? Is God's morality changing? I would ask my mother these questions, and she just sort of like reflect them off and not really have answers. That shut me down. I was just like, okay, I'm going to start looking at my beliefs now from where the evidence leads. And I came across apologetics, and I realized, you don't have to be a young earth creationist. And I was an old earth creationist. I wasn't a theistic evolutionist yet. I wasn't too certain of that because I hadn't done enough research into it. And so I followed where the evidence lead. And now I still had biases. Everyone does. You can't do epistemology without having some form of biases. I would say from human nature, it's very improbable to do that. There may be a few who are what do you call patients who people who are lobotomized? Maybe they're fully consistent logically.
Yeah,
epistemologists
have the ability not to be.
Yeah, but people who have a full brain and emotions, biases will affect your epistemology. But I tried to limit mine as much as possible. Like, yeah, I was afraid of death, but like I'm a cynic by nature, because just how my father's side is. We're just cynics. We're just doubtful. So like, yeah, if we're afraid of something, that won't change how we believe things and we believe things. Now, our methodology of how we investigate evidence is really bad starting points, but like, because I'm a philosophy major, I understand epistemology more than my brother or father. I like arguing with them just to annoy them because it's funny. But with that, because of my cynical nature, sometimes it's just irrational skepticism. My point is that in spite of fears, we try and look at claims rationally, whether we have the right standard of rationality I would claim I have a better understanding because I've been studying philosophy for 3 years now and epistemology itself. I looked at Christianity from that standpoint, and through my studies now, I just find it to be more compelling and true. And because of that, I place my faith in God and Christ and so on. Not because of in spite of evidence or in absence of evidence.
So you followed the evidence that you saw, and it concluded at Christianity, and that's.
I can be wrong too. I'm always going to say that.
Everyone can be wrong.
Yeah.
But it's a case of, you stick to the position that seems most likely based on your research. If new research comes about or new evidence comes about that shows you that maybe that's not correct, you just adapt. You don't have to go from one to the other. You just adapt. And this is where I don't see the need of one person attacking another person because they believe something different. It's to some extent, if say,
if they're unopen like the online atheists, then you have to throw some form of attack to get them thinking. I mean, you have to use their methodology against them, as I sort of talked about earlier. And now when you start asking simple questions and you show you're more open, then that makes some more open. But like, just if they're in this mindset of putting all religious people into the same category of wanting to control what you do with your life and your body and so on.
That's it, yeah.
And, then they're going to view me that way. And I either have to do the same stereotype of, well, you just hate God and you believe in magic. You believe something came from nothing and consciousness proved into existence from material brain states. Yeah, I can straw man too. I mean, do you appreciate that? No. Okay, let's have an honest conversation, be more open. And that sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't work. And I go back and forth between showing my openness or, it just depends on the context and the person. That's what I'm trying to say.
A lot of these folks that are horrible online or unnecessarily harsh online, if you take them aside and have a drink with them, I'm sure they're very, very friendly people. The majority of atheists and the majority of theists are very friendly, genuine people.
Yeah.
It's just that they believe something slightly different. I mean, these big, loud atheists and the big, loud, fundamentally religious people are a very small minority of what it is, and it gives a bad reputation for both sides. I mean, when I was, before I started looking at the nature of life after death, after my anxiety, I was a materialist, I suppose, by definition. I believe that once you die, brain creates consciousness, because I had no reason to think otherwise. But if I hadn't have had the anxiety and the fear of death that necessitated me looking into it, I would still be like that, because I had no need to really look at it. And I think a lot of people don't consider these possibilities. But I think a lot of people they don't have the need to look for evidence beyond what they think is true. So why would they ever look for the evidence, which is a shame, especially with a near-death experience. You see it a lot. And you can listen to people that are talking about it. They've never looked at the research, you can tell. They've never had an experience beyond their comprehension before. So what need do they have? The problem is when they go on and start pushing their beliefs.
Yes.
And they as true, when in reality they're not aware of the evidence that's out there to contradict.
They have a sense of entitlement because they either had a lack of personal experience or a bad experience in the church. Yeah, that's horrible. You had that experience in the church, or it's unfortunate you never had a religious experience. I don't think that's the only reason why one should be a Christian. I think they should know sound doctrine and study it and see the reasons for it, and I think that gives them a stronger faith and commitment to God and Christ.
Yeah, but I mean, this isn't just in terms of the atheists. The fundamentally religious will say about the near-death experience that it's satanic, or out-of-body experiences that they're satanic.
I've never heard that before, actually. I know there are some Christians who think that these out-of-body experiences are somehow unbiblical. I would say when people claim they went to heaven and saw God and came back, I would say those are probably hallucinations, because a lot of those are tied with the temporal lobe, and that's still active when they're under. So those are probably hallucinations of some sort.
It's whether they're hallucinations or whether it's. I'm more inclined to believe that these experiences are happening, but the interpretation of the mind of these experiences is based on your cultural background.
Yeah, but the out-of-body experiences themselves are like an objective, almost an objective fact about human consciousness and its nature, that it doesn't work. It's not completely controlled by the brain. Well, my view of the soul, I view that you ultimately do need a brain in order for your soul to grow and consciousness to grow, but it's not dependent upon that. So, like,
I'd
let's
agree.
say a baby dies, obviously, there have some sort of experience, but it's not going to be the same as when I die and have an out of body experience. So your brain has to be fully developed for your consciousness to fully develop, I would argue.
Yeah, I mean, the brain is a very important tool because it gives us access to exist in this realm, dimension, part of reality, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Without that, you see people that have astral projections or out of body experiences in NDEs, and they're not able to interact in the same way, so they don't get the lessons that we'd learn from this. And these phenomena, they don't give evidence that the brain doesn't create consciousness. They give evidence that the brain is not dependent, or the consciousness is not dependent on the brain. So it may be that the brain creates consciousness initially, but then it can become independent. So that's as far as it can kind of suggest. I think that there's one individual self that goes through different brains and experiences different things. You call it reincarnation, I suppose, in the same sort of way. Again, it's speculation. I haven't got a clue. I'm not dead, and I don't remember the last time I did die, if I did die before. But
I guess my problem with positing something like that would be like Occam's razor.
Yeah.
Pausing past experiences, the fact that you can't remember said experiences. I just feel like it would be unnecessary to posit that, even as an explanation, but it's possible at least, I guess.
Although there is data from the University of Virginia Department of Perceptual Studies that a guy called Dr. Jim Tucker and Dr. Ian Stevenson, who were researching past lives and came up with many children and I think adults as well, who were remembering these past lives of normal individual kind of random people who were then later verified to be completely accurate. I mean, one was an extra in a Hollywood kind of environment that no one had ever heard of, and this kid was able to give incredible detail about this, and he said, "This is who I was in the past." I mean, in childish language, but that's what the idea was.
That's interesting.
So there is data.
Okay, I've never heard of stuff like that before. I did hear one time of apparently this one girl getting a heart transplant, and she remembered a murderer's memories or something. They were actually able to, I don't know how true that is, but they were apparently able to find where this murderer was and who he was and stuff. Stuff like that is very interesting.
It is.
I wouldn't go as far to call it incarnation, but like maybe a truthfulness. Because under idealism, there are idealists may be able to explain it. Tim is an idealist, so he may understand that better. Because there's almost an aspect of our past lives. Idealism is confusing. I never use that because I don't fully understand it, but there are some Christian views of that would maybe be able to explain that data. But I won't go as far to affirm anything like Buddhism or Hinduism because I would say there are logical contradictions.
Well, I mean, you wouldn't even
they're
have
not
to
concerned
go.
with that. They're not concerned with logic.
You wouldn't even have to go into the whole framework of the Hindu or Buddhist religion. You just say that well, it seems that the data suggests that this is the case. Maybe it's worth looking into that a bit more. And this is what these folks at the university have done. I haven't really properly looked at it, but
now are these people who have like new parts put into them, or how did they
no?
have
These are just spontaneous memories.
Oh, spontaneous memories.
And you also have the astral projectors and the out-of-body experiencers who are able to view what they consider to be the Akashic records, where they have visions and memories of past lives they've had. Some of them, hundreds of lives. I don't know if there's any case of them being verified or not.
Obviously, it's all speculation, but maybe a possible explanation would be maybe a soul or something outside is reaching you and putting these memories into you or something. Maybe that's why you're having them. Yeah. I would just use that as sort of a counterexample to maybe say, maybe it's just as plausible reincarnation because there's not enough.
It's possible. I mean, there's
a lot that you can't falsify here.
Yeah.
And so anything really works at this point.
See, this is what Tom Jum tries to do with naturalistic pantheism, and it's almost the right way of it can almost be brilliant, but when you actually look at the evidence and the claims of naturalistic pantheism and the claims of Christian theism and classical theism, no, the evidence is not equally valid, and one view explains it better than the other. And
what are the basics of naturalistic pantheism?
Well, C.S. Lewis sort of describes it as God is the universe and animates the universe is God, but it's almost like the body of God. But to me, I find a problem with that because, it ignores the problem of the one and the many. And we know the universe most likely had a beginning 13.8 billion years ago, so you would almost have to affirm something came from nothing. But many Hindus would almost affirm sort of like a static universe, an oscillating model, which is unscientific, or not verified by the data, I should say. So that would be one problem I'd have with it. But as just calling things God, and you're not able to demonstrate this universal consciousness. Now, idealism would say there's universal consciousness, but it's not grounded in the universe. It would be grounded in the mind of God, who's the agent. So there are some Christian monists who would almost affirm something like that. These would be
I'm not 100% monist in that. Yeah. That's why I lean to a dual aspect of idealism. There's a at the bottom of reality, metaphysical rock bottom. There's a rational foundation anchoring what we're experiencing. So,
but one divine attribute of God that would explain some, in the classical arguments for God's existence, divine simplicity is a necessary attribute for God to, for these arguments to work. But naturalistic pantheism, clearly, if God is composed of all these parts and is this one universal collection, there's no such thing as divine simplicity. So there's already a piece of data in which naturalistic pantheism cannot equally account for. If divine simplicity does account for better data than not. But I just say there's coherent problems with naturalistic pantheism. Unless you just start calling that nature, in which, okay, you're just redefining your worldview at that point, and it's circular reasoning at that point.
I see it as giving the universe divine features, the cosmos divine features, and basically what you're doing is you're really just arguing that the universe is the foundation of reality, and that it is necessary, it is eternal, it is able to give rise to consciousness or whatever. You could even make it more sophisticated. And
some pantheists may describe it. The naturalistic pantheism Tom Jump uses doesn't include consciousness because he tries to refute consciousness, which is a better strategy, because obviously, if you affirm a type of consciousness,
well, you could go with panpsychism, and you can make it more sophisticated and say that
that would be this universal consciousness. I think that's in the universe.
Right. And honestly, they're not far from my view. They're just stopping too early. They're positing that the universe does that rather than
a mind like God.
Yeah, a foundational mind, foundational mentality is giving rise. So that's how I would put that view.
Yeah, I would just say that pantheism doesn't account with the science and logic itself, but a lot aren't concerned with that.
I mean, Tom's position and many others' position of consciousness being an emergent property of the brain, you can respect, because there's a lot of evidence in support of that. You damage the brain, you damage consciousness, you do a lobotomy, and you change yourself.
I would just say that's a correlation causation fallacy.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's called correlation.
Or you could just say that, the idea of the soul and emergent property of the brain, equally accounts for the evidence. So let's sort of argue which is more coherent at that point. Yeah.
But the other thing is despite there being a lot of evidence for that, once you start looking at some of these other anomalous experience phenomenon, there are evidences that seem to falsify that, because these shouldn't happen. These heretical perception, and then all you've got is, well, these aren't actually, these are liars, these are delusions, these are bad scientific methods, whatever, anything but perhaps this idea needs to be expanded a little bit more.
And that comes from their prior beliefs and their what do we call that last night, Tim, with Bayes' theorem? Prior belief.
Prior probability.
Yeah, prior probability. Their prior probability for a soul existing is much lower, and therefore any data they interpret will not fit with their preconceived notions or their prior probability. And this is why metaphysics and philosophy, or your worldview, is very important. And just approaching it from an atheist lack of belief perspective doesn't really do anything for anyone, even the person themselves, I would say.
I mean, you can have a lack of belief, you can be an atheist, you can be a Christian, but as long as you're open-minded enough to consider that your position may be incorrect or incomplete.
Yeah, or your own position to be incorrect or incomplete.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Oh, okay, my bad. I thought you said other people's positions.
Well, I mean, yeah, that as well.
General.
Yeah. Anyone's position is everybody's position is likely wrong or incomplete to some extent. The size and complexity of the universe.
Incomplete is a good way of putting it. Likely wrong because I'll say I don't believe I'm likely wrong because I believe what I believe for rational reasons. If I thought I was likely wrong, I won't believe them. But can I be wrong? Most certainly.
Because the evidence that you've used to get to that experience or to that belief is based on the science that we currently understand, which may be incomplete or incorrect.
Yeah.
So any conclusions that derive from the way that we study could be incomplete and incorrect, if the foundation is itself incomplete or incorrect.
Now, when it comes to logical truths, as I described earlier, I don't think in 2,000, 5,000, if I'm somehow alive in 10,000 years, I don't think those beliefs could change, just because the thought experiment itself just presupposes it. It's just a justified axiom. That to even try to possibly say, well, I could possibly be wrong about that, that just leads to an infinite regress. And at that point, you might as well not even think about these questions and just live life. And, when you're dead at that point. But I said a lot there. I don't know where you want the conversation to go at this point.
Yeah. When we start to get into philosophy, you really do go down rabbit holes constantly.
What do you mean by rabbit hole?
You start with a subject, then you start talking, then something else suddenly comes in. You think,
that's
well, maybe
me in general.
Yeah,
like I'll be talking.
That's philosophy.
Well, no, that's just my personality type. I would say there are philosophers that can communicate it and stay on one topic. I just whenever I just start thinking of something, new thoughts pop into my head. I just have to start thinking about it then. So that's just how my mind works. But like, if you ever need a definition or clarification, just let me know. I'll just go on some more rabbit holes for you.
Rabbit holes, yeah. Go down an entire burrow at that point.
I'll dig to China for us.
Yeah. Well, from here it'd be Australia.
But, we just fall through the earth anyway, so.
What do you say to people that say things like in the Bible? Because we know that there's a lot of very controversial things in, especially the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Which would question the morality of God as we define morality. Some of the things that he, her, whatever gender it is, things that they suggest could be construed as very, very immoral. So, how would you? Well, I mean, the sort of things that maybe God ordered in the Old Testament would be seen by many people as not a good thing to do.
So the first point I would make is a lot of the stuff that go to the Old Testament, it's just descriptions of what other people are doing, and they smuggle in God commanded it. But there's a few things like, with the judges and conquest of Jericho, or, Joshua. But one point to make with the Mosaic covenant, a lot of these laws are didactic. So they're not like the 10 Commandments almost prescribing something that is objective. Just rather, God is dealing with the hardness of people's hearts, as Jesus says in Matthew, I'm pretty sure on top of my head. And at that point, God is dealing with people in which he's not dealing with the current society. He's dealing with their covenant and relationship at that point with the nation of Israel. So a lot of these laws are just God allowing them to practice cultural norms in a better way. Because, there's a form of indentured servitude allowed, in which, people are in debt, and they need to pay off their debts and so on. So this was allowed. But like, God clearly commands in Exodus 20, love thy neighbor as thyself. And people will just argue, well, that's just with, the Hebrews and Israelites. And it's just like, not really. If you look at Genesis 1, man is created in the image of God, and they have that intrinsic worth. So that's still presupposed in the whole book itself, or the whole theology behind the Mosaic covenant. And there's also passages that says, be kindful to the sojourners and foreigners and so on. So, God is taking and making a nation around these other nations and making, I would say, this nation better than these nations. Tim may be able to explain this a little bit better than me, but it's been a while. Because a year and a half ago, I did a few videos with a guy who used to be on my channel. He's not anymore. But there's a few videos explaining slavery in the Bible. And the apparent commands of genocide and so on. Basically, a lot of the time, the methodology is God has to communicate his message in an omniscient, omnipotent way in which we don't have to do any research whatsoever into ancient culture, and exegesis, which is finding out what does this actually mean in its appropriate time and place and culture, while they're just arguing, well, we should just be able to understand it with a sixth grade reading level, and that's where I think many of these objections come from. But there's better scholarly objections, like, well, are foreigners allowed to be kept as slaves? And I would just say, their debts aren't canceled like the Hebrew Israelites in the year of Jubilee, and their terms are extended past the 7-year mark in Exodus 21. But as soon as they pay off their debt that they owe, then they're allowed to go. So when it says you can pass them down as property, it's just telling them if they haven't paid their debt off yet, you can continue to keep them until they pay off their debt. That's all it's saying in Leviticus 25 or 48, I think.
The whole idea of slavery and people opposing the biblical slavery as immoral or generally just wrong, I think you're assuming it's wrong, which it would be in today's culture, but you're talking 2,000 years ago.
Think about this: if I don't pay my debts or taxes, the government puts me at gunpoint, basically throws me in jail. That to me is a lot worse than what we have in the Old Testament. I'm not defending what in the Old Testament, which wasn't prescribed, it's described in the Mosaic Covenant. I would say is subjective morality at that point and isn't being made objective. I would say the Ten Commandments outright abolish anything like chattel slavery. I mean, do not covet things that aren't yours. If there's a human soul out there, they clearly aren't yours. And I would say rape is included in there because rape is, going against one's consent in sexual relations at that point. And I would say that's presupposed in the 9th commandment, which has to do with covetousness towards things that aren't yours. Loving things beyond their worth, you could say, as Augustine would say.
And I think it's also helpful to. Are you familiar with what hermeneutics is?
Very, very, very loosely.
Okay, so just quick rundown. Basically, hermeneutics is the art and science behind Bible interpretation.
Or interpretation in general, and this is where atheists miss the point that we're just not making up this term so we can get past your objections and
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is this interpretation of the different versions of the Bible, the English version, or is it of the original Hebrew?
It's of the. That's a really good question. It encompasses everything.
Mm-hmm.
So
surely you'd want to go back to the original version.
Yeah, there's a lot of gaps to bridge. So, for example, in Roy B. Zuck's Basics of Bible Interpretation book, he was a professor at seminary for a long time. So he's a reputable figure. He has the way he lays it out is he says that there are certain gaps that you need to bridge, and the one that you're talking about would be the language gap. There's a linguistic gap, there's a literary gap, there's a grammatical gap, and things of that sort. So it encompasses all that, and this is the kind of the process that you use to ascertain the meaning of what the text is at, and so it's very helpful because when we're looking at slavery as depicted in the Old Testament, we as Westerners, 21st century Westerners, want to think of, since in America we think of biblical slavery, American slavery. We think of
you think of the black slave trade, all
exactly
that stuff.
And we go, oh, that's what slavery means. But
even Dr. Josh, Tim, I watched this one podcast from Help My Confirmation Bias. If you watch the podcast, but
I saw something with him recently. I can't remember which one it was.
Yeah, it was on. Oh, do you watch Help Me Believe?
No, I just it popped up in my feed after watching your video.
Yeah, Dr. Josh Bowen. He's an agnostic Assyriologist, and he agrees with us on a lot, and almost says, "Look, you atheists need to stop saying that you can beat your slaves, if that's the right word, to almost to death, just as long as you don't break a tooth or an eye." No, he's saying that no, you should treat them as a human being. He agrees with them to that. He's just simply saying that, yeah, there's distinction between Hebrew slaves and foreigner slaves, and they can be. I would disagree with him on being passed down as inheritance and so on, but he's not saying that you can take away. He admits they have rights just like me and you would have, basic human rights. Just obviously they're in a pickle that sucks for their time, and they have to deal with that. And perhaps the options God gave could be better, but I would say, you would have to establish a system like America, which you're not going to be able to do in the Middle East at that time.
So yeah, so it's helpful to use hermeneutics to kind of travel back in time and to look at it as, okay, well, what does this actually mean, and things of that sort. Are we talking about indentured servitude, or are we talking about people working against their will, and being malnourished at the same time, and things of that sort? So
what do you think, after these scholars have looked at this and established this is what they mean, why do you think then the Bibles haven't been republished to show that, as opposed to still having the kind of the metaphors in there which get confused, like with the slavery, the concept of that? Would it not be best if these scholars did a revision of the Bible and put those meanings in? So
yeah, and a lot of people ask this question. So going back to hermeneutics, and going on what Old Testament scholar John Walton says, the Bible wasn't written to us; it was written for us. So the ancient writers were writing to their audience. They were not, when you post something on Facebook or Twitter, you're not thinking, how should I write this so that people 2,000 years from now will exactly know what I mean? You don't do that. No one does that.
No.
So the things that the way that they're speaking, so you have a completely different language, and you have a completely different culture, traditions, mindset, and a way of thinking. They're writing to their immediate audience, and they know what they will. They will know what they mean by the way that they're writing. We're kind of, so for us now, being separated by those many years, that's why the whole bridging the gap thing makes sense, which is it's not in the sense of, basically what you're saying is it should just be really apparent and obvious, and everyone should just be able to look at this and read it once and know exactly what it means, when that is not how really the scriptures even work. We're dealing with an ancient text, and so that's kind of how that works. And I feel like even if we try to make a new living Bible or a new updated Bible, we would have to always constantly be updating it in terms of how people are progressively thinking of that sort, rather than
well, we have the tools like concordances and glossaries.
Exactly. And I was about to say, rather than using the tools that we have.
And it's not like we have to know Greek and Hebrew to understand what it originally meant. Now, obviously, to get every nitty-gritty detail, Hebrew and Greek is very good, but just the basic English versions along with the concordance, or like Bible Logos or Blue Letter Bible is good enough.
And we're still finding out a lot.
Because it's written by the scholars for laymen's, like, well, I've done a little bit of studying. I had like a class on Greek that didn't go too well because my mind doesn't work that way. And I have to learn something like that over a longer period of time, not in one semester. But the nice thing is, though, that I don't have to know Greek in order to understand the original context, because you can get commentaries. If an issue in the Old Testament is such a barrier for you, and get commentaries, try and look into it. If you're just going to hide behind the excuse like the online atheists will do, well, an omniscient, omnipotent God would make it this way. First of all, he could, but he doesn't have to. And secondly, that's very for being a champion of reason and logic, you're not really putting academic research in your methodology there. But that's beside the point. The fact is, we can do this with most stuff in the Old and New Testament for understanding. But like, if you're going to be a scholar and like looking into history, the historical events and archaeology with the New Testament, obviously you have to know a lot more than just basic English versions, along with commentaries, concordances, which is just matching the English with the Greek or Hebrew word that means, or giving the meanings. Then you use hermeneutics, because one word can have multiple meanings, just like how we do with basic grammar nowadays. You just use the context to fit the best meaning, basically. And it's honestly not that complicated. To get a good setup takes a little bit, but ultimately when you get that setup, it's not that difficult at all. But see, I think I tried my best to not even go into that when discussing slavery in the Bible. I'll just take all the verses out of their context and that address slavery, and I'll just think at it logically. I think when you do that, you don't get the atheist standpoint whatsoever, or the objector standpoint to the Old Testament, slavery, and so on. Because there's a verse: if you return a runaway slave, you'll be put to death. That just instantly applies. If they want to stop being your servant at that point because you're being a horrible human being, they can just leave and stay in town. Obviously, they're still going to have that debt, but if you try, or if someone else returns them to you, by the law, you're to be put to death, which seems to imply there that a harsh treatment of a fellow human being is bad.
Yeah, that's how I'd interpret that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, see, and that's independent of the culture itself and context. Just using that one verse alone, I think you can just refute their entire case.
Well, I feel like we covered actually kind of a lot of ground, and each topic we covered could be fleshed out in just for hours, just each individual one. But trying to be as helpful as possible here. But no, I think that when it comes to really understanding Christianity and things of that sort, it's how do we approach the text, and a lot of it is going back to the whole mere Christianity deal, that Christianity is already assuming that God exists, of that sort, and so that's where natural theology comes in. So if you have good reasons to believe in God, then it comes down to which religion has God revealed himself in, and things of that sort. And so John and I would affirm that God has revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ by vindicating him and raising him from the dead, and these things can be verified and whatnot. So that's how I look at Christianity, and also Christianity is not just a proposition. It's not just one truth claim. It's from that truth claim, it also it affects your inner life at the same time. It's not just Jesus rose from the dead. Is what does that mean, and things. And so if that's true, then what you talk about, your specialty being near-death experiences, afterlife, and things of that sort. Really, it becomes quite contextualized and gives an actual genuine hope if these things are true, as Paul says, and he says that if Christ has not been raised, then us Christians should be our most and should be pitied. We have a false hope. So, but if those things are true, then we have a true hope, and it is one that should be believed and proclaimed. So that's how I would say that.
And I'd encourage you to specifically address you. I would encourage you to get a New Testament. I'd suggest ESV or NASB. And in your search of truth and so on, when it comes to religious beliefs, I'd start with Christianity, because I gave that distinction between the other two. God comes down to man and claims to be the truth himself. And clearly Jesus, if you look at history, has the most influence on human society and culture. So I'd start with the dude who claimed to be the truth and investigate him first, and look at the resurrection and read the New Testament and see how that fits with you.